Welcome to the Spiritual Leadership Podcast. My name is Alanna, and it is my absolute honor and pleasure to bring a fantastic topic to you today that is definitely one of my favorites, is close to my heart. And since I only rebooted the podcast a few episodes ago, I thought it would be an excellent way to lay some good foundation for what we're going to be talking about on the Spiritual Leadership Podcast and give you the knowledge that you need to really start stepping into your role as a spiritual leader. Now, I'm sure at some point on this podcast, I'll get a little bit fancier and do the intro and all of that kind of stuff. I've done that before. But, to be honest with you, I'm really just here to talk and share what I know and things that I believe will help you become a spiritual leader in your space. So if you haven't listened to my last episode on spiritual leadership, talking more about exactly what that is, I definitely invite you to check that out. But know that if you are listening to this podcast, if you've stumbled onto it, if you found me in whatever way that you did, that it's likely that you are meant to be here. I don't believe that there are any accidents in the universe, and I'm really glad that you're here listening. And I'm really glad and honored that you are a part of my community. One of the things that I believe that I've come to know after more than 20 years of working in this space is that we are needed. That the work that we do as yoga teachers, as spiritual practitioners, as spiritual leaders, has always been necessary. And the thing that I have come to know, especially after the COVID-19 pandemic, is that we are more necessary than we have ever been before. We are absolutely being called to do this work because there is a rise in anxiety, depression, boredom, apathy, disconnection. They're calling this the second pandemic. And these are things that the work that you and I do are expressly designed to alleviate. And they're designed to alleviate these things in a different way than the medical professionals and the mental health professionals. You and I, as spiritual leaders, we occupy a third lane, a third option that really isn't being addressed. And this is my life's work. I am here to help people address this third option, this third lane, to work with that for you to support your clients, because we are not just physical bodies that the medical professionals can treat. And we are not just mental bodies that the mental health professionals can treat. We are also spiritual beings. And a huge part of our psyche is actually dedicated to these higher, more metaphysical, lofty, spiritual type of questions or inquiries that, again, neither the mental health professionals or the medical professionals can really touch on. And now I'm not saying that there aren't professionals in those fields that are deeply spiritual and try to bring that work to those fields. Of course there are. But in a general way and in general practice, those two fields don't work with the spirit in the way that you and I can, and in the way that humans have needed the work throughout human history. This is why we have spiritual practice. This is why we have formalized religion, because there are always going to be questions from us as humans about what is our purpose? What are we doing here? How do we manifest our greatest potential? What does this life mean? How do we bring meaning to it? Are we moving in the right direction? Those types of questions, those types of inquiries are what spiritual practice address. And when you have a connection to spiritual practice and to your own spirit, however you define that, then you have less disconnection. You have less apathy. You have less boredom. You have purpose. You have meaning. You have drive. You are less inclined toward things like anxiety or depression because you have consolation for some of these bigger questions that life tends to present us. Now, I'm not saying that this is the only way to work with those particular things, but it is a powerful way, and it is a way not worked with enough. In our modern Western society, many people have either turned away from their religious practices or their spiritual practices, or they're confused about exactly what to do for their religious practice or spiritual practice, or they're turned off by religion. All of these things are okay. But it doesn't mean that the need to address these things has gone. We as humans have evolved over millions of years. We as humans have been in society and culture for hundreds of thousands of years. The need for those answers to life's bigger questions doesn't just disappear overnight. And in fact, a huge part of our psyche is dedicated to this. About 25% of our psyche is dedicated to the metaphysical reality that we occupy. The bigger questions that can't be seen, that can't be tested through the scientific method, the things that just require faith. Faith is a beautiful word in English, but I am actually partial to the Sanskrit word for faith, which is shraddha. Shraddha is what fills your heart, the contents of your heart, the things inside your heart that set your heart on fire and make you push through any hard thing that you come up against. If your heart isn't full, if you're not sure what occupies the contents of your heart, why would you ever do anything hard? What would motivate you to move past a challenge? It is faith. It is this bigger metaphysical reality that we are a part of that creates true transformation, that shows us who we are, that gives us the grist for the mill, that makes healing bearable, that makes pain tolerable, that makes suffering worth it. So we've got to know what the contents of our heart are, and we need to know how to define it. And what's really interesting is that in this modern Western society, there are a million ways to define it. One of the things that we take pride in this culture, in this current day and age, is our individuality, is our ability to decide for ourselves what is important and compelling in life. Well, it doesn't mean we all have the parameters and the know-how to decide exactly that, and that's why spiritual leadership is important. For someone to help guide another person to finding what sets their heart on fire, to finding what they most fervently believe in is really important. That guidance has always been present for us in human culture. They've typically been present as the clergy. But again, in our complicated modern Western society, where we like to be individuals, where we've largely and in ever-growing numbers pushed away formalized religious practice, we still need guidance. We still need the things the clergy once did in order for us to fill our hearts, find our faith, provide ourselves with lasting spiritual connection and growth and transformation. Doesn't happen in a vacuum. So I hope all that encourages you, my dear listener, to realize how important you are and how important the work you are doing is. And with that, I'd like to move into the topic today, which is spiritual psychology. So I mentioned this a little bit in the last podcast, but the rise of modern psychology occurred around 120 years or so ago. It was pretty much founded by Freud and Jung, Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. There were others, but those are the most notable ones and the earlier history ones. It's evolved since then. But the reason why psychology was developed in the first place was as a direct reaction to religious practice, because the people that those sought for counsel, the clergy members, were falling out of favor. At the turn of the Industrial Revolution, the move was towards science, fact-based things that you could see, evidence-based stuff that you could prove. Faith was, kind of yesterday. We don't need that old-time religion. I think there's a song lyric that says that. So the psychologists developed a way to look at behavior. They observed behavior, they observed repeatable patterns, and through those observable, repeatable patterns, psychology was developed. And it was developed without any connection to spirit, and in fact, it was developed in reaction to it and with the rejection of spirit. We didn't want any spirituality in our psychology back in those days, and largely to the greater extent, we still feel that way today. And again, that's not wrong. There's no judgment around that. It is a whole different discipline and a very valid science, one which I also have a degree in. But we need to know psychology's limitations. It's very important to understand where it began, where it is now, how we utilize it, and what it might be missing. And what it's missing is that spiritual connection. And the reality is that we are not just bodies. We are not just minds. We are something greater. And one of the things that I will both simultaneously do and try not to do on this podcast is give you parameters for what that something greater might be, but to define it entirely. I can't define it entirely. I'm not even sure exactly what it is either. We don't have to know. We just have to connect to it. We have to open ourselves to it. We have to feel it. We have to know how it represents itself to us, what the meaning of it is to us. And whatever we define it as, whatever our history, background, desires, faith is composed of, is all ultimately awesomely okay. Right? I'm not here to put the parameters on that. I'm here to put parameters on how we guide people toward it, and to give you the opportunity and the understanding and the training and the knowledge to do this work more readily with your clients, because they are desperate for it from you. They have sought you out because they believe you have some of this knowledge and wisdom. They know they need it. And hopefully here with me, you can get the training you need to really move into this space and guide people appropriately to their highest aims and goals. So psychology starts in this reactionary period of trying to really cut out spirit from the mind or the psyche. And we just really can't do that. We just really can't. It's like trying to treat pain without knowing exactly what the person is feeling or experiencing from it. Pain is largely psychological. Injury is different. Injury is physical, but pain can be almost entirely psychological. You have to talk to the person. The mind is involved. So I think that there's a better understanding and acceptance these days that the mind and body are together. And I think we're still working to come around to acknowledge that, you know what, spirit is still there too. As much as we may have tried to push it down or away or reject it or redefine it, still there. It's still a part of who we are. So let's talk about the psyche, right? The psyche is your entire psychic interface. Everything that isn't physical, everything that I can't cut open and show you is your psyche. And the psyche is composed of three main parts. The part that we're all familiar with, and the part that psychologists work most with, and even I'll explain a little bit later, the part that yoga practices work most with, is with the conscious mind. The conscious mind is your personality, the way that you interface and interact with the world. It's the way that people experience you. It is your mental chatter, the thoughts that you're aware of. That's your conscious mind. And if you're watching this on video, you'll see me, I'm brushing my fingers across kind of the front of my face to indicate this is where I generally imagine. I mean, the psyche is everywhere. It doesn't have defined locations. But because we see out of our eyes, and because our personalities are so written on our faces, and because we associate our pretty little heads with who we are, I often think of the conscious mind as located in this space on our body. It's the world that we see. It's the way that we interact with the world. It's how people communicate and interface with us. So the conscious mind, as we all know, especially for those of us who practice and teach yoga, can get quite stuck. We get into negative thought patterns. We get into downward spirals. We get convinced that, oh, this is just the way I am. That is a very common statement of the conscious mind. We think that we are fixed, that there is no change possible. But as spiritual practitioners, we absolutely must know that change is possible for us, and that there is no truth to the statement, oh, that's just the way I am. Because if you look over the course of your life, and let's say you break out your life into 4 stages, the first quarter of your life, the second quarter of your life, the third and the fourth quarters of your life. If you think about who you were in each of those 4 stages, you're going to notice that there are differences. There is something that you lost from childhood, a way that you were. There's something that happened to you in your teenage and early adult years that perhaps you've also lost or changed. Maybe you grew up. Maybe you got real about the world, and maybe you developed into some cynical attitudes. And then perhaps in the last quarter of your life, the most recent quarter, you've softened that a bit. Of course you've changed. There is no, that's just the way I am. When we have thoughts like that, when we've got the mental chatter, when we're in the negative spiral, when the thoughts just won't leave us alone, that is when we suffer. And that's typically what yoga practices are meant to address, is that conscious mind, that conscious thought pattern, that conscious suffering, and probably most importantly, that firm belief of the conscious that is who we are. But again, if you've done some spiritual practice of any form, but especially of yoga, you have hopefully absorbed the idea that this is not who you are, that there is more to you than that. So we've got the first part of the psyche, which is the conscious mind, and I'll explain the second part, which is the unconscious mind. And I like to think of this as being underneath. It's like the vessel with all of the stuff that bubbles to the surface. It's the container for all of our history. And in yoga, we would call it our karma. And that doesn't require any belief in past lives, by the way. We've all been through enough in just this one lifetime to put plenty of stuff into that vessel, to have a very teeming unconscious, teeming with the things that bubble up to the surface in ways that we're not even aware of. Now, quick point of fact, if you are in the field of psychology, you will refer to this as the unconscious, as that's the proper psychological term. When you're watching movies and television shows, they'll refer to it as the subconscious. We're talking about the same thing, but the pop term is subconscious. The proper psychological term is unconscious. And the reason for that is subconscious indicates beneath, as in less than. And I promise you, dear listener, that there is nothing less than or beneath in the unconscious. In fact, Carl Jung has a beautiful quote that if you don't make the unconscious conscious, it will rule your life and you will call it fate. What's in the unconscious is absolutely critical and important, and it really drives our day-to-day lives, what we see, what we observe, what we notice, how we react, how we behave, perhaps most importantly, what we feel. And all of the unconscious is developed in early childhood. Now, I know if you haven't studied a lot of psychology, I understand that statement may seem cliche, but fortunately or unfortunately, cliches exist for a reason. There's generally some sort of historical truth to those cliches. There's something that goes on. And in psychology, there is a great understanding that our early childhoods, particularly prior to age 5 and mostly prior to age 7, all of the unconscious is imbued with attitudes, behaviors, assumptions about the world. Things Carl Jung would call complexes. Carl Jung is the founder of depth psychology, by the way. Complexes are what I like to describe as hardened loops. Okay, and this is how I understand karma, by the way, because karma gets a bit of a bad rap and a massive misunderstanding here in the West. We think of karma as being retributive, as in it's going to come and get you. And it doesn't. Karma doesn't have any kind of revenge agenda. And in fact, karma is neither good nor bad. It just is. Karma is how we react to whatever event is occurring in front of us. And our reaction is predetermined based on our childhood. So in the unconscious, we have these hardened loops of behavior. And I'll give you an example. So imagine a 5-year-old child witnesses its caregivers having a fight. We don't even know what the fight is about. We don't have to know. But boy, is that scary to that young child. Perhaps they've never seen the caregivers fight before. And so in order to try to alleviate the pain and the stress of witnessing this conflict, the 5-year-old decides to run and hide under the bed. And boy, it's nice to be out of that conflict. It's nice to be away from that. It's nice to pretend like that isn't happening. And for the 5-year-old, that's a great response. It's a self-protection mechanism. It removes one from the stressful event. Excellent response for the 5-year-old. The 5-year-old decides that's a great way to deal with conflict. And so that loop now becomes closed and stuck in the unconscious. And so now as the 5-year-old grows older, and now let's say this 5-year-old is 35, and there's an event in the 35-year-old's life that feels similar to that first initial event with the caregivers. It feels like conflict. It feels terrifying. And so the 35-year-old pushes the eject button and runs away. Perhaps not to hide under the bed, but to get away from the situation rather than doing the adult thing, which would simply be to address the conflict head on and move toward resolution. If the hardened loop of behavior is still active, then every time we run into something that feels like an early event, we will react like we did in that early event. And that's why many people are grown children, because they're still operating with these very young templates, patterns of behavior, these complexes. Now, our work in spirituality, our work in spiritual leadership is to help identify when these triggers occur. The triggers occur when we have an emotional reaction, pretty much always a negative emotional reaction, and one that makes us go, as I like to call it, unconscious, into just an emotional reaction that perhaps doesn't make sense. It's perhaps not in measure with the event itself. Perhaps we get angrier than is really worthy of what's happening at the moment. And what I would stress and aim to impress upon you is that we are actually never angry for the reason that we think we are. If we feel angry or upset or frustrated or any of the litany of negative human emotion, it is actually because of an early hardened loop, a complex, or a piece of karma. And we're touching a piece of pain or a wounding. And the best thing we can do is actually create some space from that pain and wounding and try to break that loop and try to react in a way that an adult mind would react, one with a fully developed prefrontal cortex that can make excellent decisions and do something differently. That even in the midst of the emotional reaction, we take a pause, we break the loop, we behave in a more elevated manner, and in doing so, we not only break the loop, but spiral it up so that the next time we revisit a similar situation, which we will, that we have some space. We have a potentially different, more elevated reaction. Now, this is all inside the unconscious. The unconscious is the repository of all of our early childhood experiences, those things that we react to, our triggers, the things that rear the ugly head. The unconscious is also the location of our beliefs about the world around us. The unconscious is the harbinger of what we call our archetypes, our understanding of basic human things like mother, parent, father, sibling, friend. All of the world around us is colored in some way by our early belief systems about what these things should be or about what we believe that they are. So you can see that the unconscious is pretty powerful. It's pretty powerful and it's pretty dominant in our lives. Now, interestingly, I come from a background steeped in yoga. I've been in the yoga practice and industry for more than 20 years. I have led and written teacher trainings for yoga studios around the country. I've been in yoga, inside of it, for a very long time. And one of the things that I was really moved and struck by was that not only is yoga a psychology, which pretty amazing for Patanjali to develop that 2,000 years ago, but that it has a big missing piece. Yoga as a psychology does not really address or acknowledge the unconscious. It talks about karma almost as a decentralized event, something that's not within us. It also uses a practice of meditation, and we all know how important meditation is to yoga, and I'm not diminishing it. However, meditation is a very conscious practice and won't necessarily address the unconscious. So, fast forward, here we are today in our modern, futuristic culture. If we are to cause deep, lasting transformation and change, we need to bring work with the unconscious to our spiritual practices. We need to recognize the people that we're working with and those in front of us as whole human beings, and that meditation doesn't always work for that because meditation doesn't address those unconscious complexes. The emotions that bubble to the surface are what need to be looked at and addressed, and they will point us to what is very deeply within us so that we can bring it forth and make it our greatest strength. Now, one of the greatest practices that I've found to work with the unconscious, and I have many, and I'll be explaining more of them as the podcast moves forward, but one of the best practices that I know of to work with the unconscious is actually the system of the chakras. We love the chakras as yogis, don't we? I got to tell you, it was always my most popular and most in-demand workshop is my chakra workshop. And it's one of my most popular online educational courses and certifications is my Alchemy of the Chakras course. Because the chakras organize the psyche in a way that is intuitive, but in a way that is already inbuilt. Similar to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If you ever took Psychology 101, you've probably heard of that. It's an organizational structure of the psyche, but the greatest thing about it is that our chakra system speaks through our physical body. And the physical body, the sensations that we have in our physical body point us back to what is alive in our unconscious and what needs to be looked at. It is a powerful and transcendent communication system. So we have an opportunity to work with the unconscious as a spiritual leader and work with people in front of us, again, in a more holistic manner, recognizing that there are 3 parts to the psyche. So now we've been through 2, the conscious mind. We've got the unconscious, which is our karma, or those hardened loops, as I've explained them, of behavior. Any emotional reaction, particularly any negative emotional reaction, is a signal that the unconscious needs to be tended to and that we're bumping up against a complex. And the third and final piece of the psyche, which I like to think of as a bit above us, because it feels that way to me, but it doesn't have to be. Remember, this isn't anatomical. This is just the way I experience it. The third part of the psyche is the supraconscious. The supraconscious, meaning beyond us. Because we are connected to things beyond us, aren't we? We do have a collective consciousness that we interact with almost as an interactive field with other humans. The superconscious allows us to connect to something bigger and greater than ourselves. Because there is something bigger and greater than ourselves. And again, we don't have to know what that is, and we don't have to define that for our clients. We don't even really necessarily have to define it for ourselves, but we know when we're connected to it. When we're connected to whatever it is bigger and greater than us, we receive inspiration. We receive inspiration. So one of my favorite ways to explain the supraconscious is the comet Hale-Bopp. Many of you may have been alive the last time it came around. I believe I was about 16 years old, and I got to see it in the sky. And the name Hale-Bopp actually comes from 2 different people on different sides of the planet who discovered the comet at the exact same time. This comet had never really been seen before. It had never really been named. And as it's hurtling through the universe, 2 people from different sides of the planet happened to look up at the same time and see the comet and call it in. So they couldn't just name it Comet Hale, and they couldn't just name it Comet Bopp. They named it Comet Hale-Bopp because the consciousness, the collective consciousness of these people was looking at the sky at the same time, knew that there was something to be discovered and known, received the inspiration to know it, and so they did. Things that we all share, the ways in which we are all interconnected is the superconsciousness. And your ability to receive inspiration comes from the superconsciousness. Your ability to keep yourself open and receptive, which we as spiritual practitioners, yoga practitioners, are infinitely trained in doing to let the conscious mind relax, to try and alleviate some of the suffering of the thoughts. Meditation can be very functional in keeping us receptive. Connecting to whatever is higher to us, naming whatever that is, will help to keep us receptive. And that receptivity allows us to, dare I use the word, channel the great inspiration that comes to us for the benefit of all. That, for someone who is a spiritual teacher, a yoga teacher, a spiritual practitioner, that is the highest way in which we can do our work. If we, from our conscious mind, try to do the work, it will not be received as well. It will not benefit others as well. It is from an ego-based place. But if we open ourselves and receive the inspiration and allow that inspiration to move through our conscious mind and then out, then we know we're serving the world and doing the work in the highest way possible. So just keep that in mind. So the super consciousness is how we connect to something greater. The unconscious is how we connect to the deepest part of ourselves. And the conscious mind is how we interact with the world throughout all of it. Now, we talk about yoga a lot, or at least I do, and you probably do too. The word yoga means union. It's likely that you know that. The original Sanskrit root of the word yoga means to yoke, or to bring two things that look separate together. Now, what is it that we're trying to yoke? We're trying to yoke ourselves. We're trying to bring ourselves together. Typically, for most humans throughout the day, there isn't interactivity or communication between these parts of ourselves. It's just the conscious mind thinking it's run the show, while meanwhile, the unconscious is completely running the show and the superconscious is being entirely ignored. It's usually how it goes. But if we were to have a line of communication between unconscious, conscious, superconscious, ways to get the signals, the messages, to hear clearly what these other parts of ourselves say, that is yoga. Yoga is a state of the psyche. It is a psycho-spiritual state. We actually are told this by Patanjali. The second Yoga Sutra, the second phrase in probably the most important text of yoga philosophy, is yogash chitta vritti nirodha, which translates to yoga is the cessation or just the calming of the fluctuations of the conscious mind. So all those thoughts that get in our way, all of those thoughts that we believe are real or who we are, if we can just get those to relax a second, if we can just get that opacity of the conscious mind to soften, to give us some perspective, to show us who we are, then we'll realize that there's so much more to us than just our thoughts and our personality. We'll realize that emotions are a communication system from deeper parts of us. We'll realize that inspiration is communication from the bigger parts of us. And we'll learn to listen to those other parts in order to move forward into manifesting our greatest potential. Now, the good news is that as spiritual leaders, we have ways to help people do this. We have techniques, we have practices, we have tools, we have other skills. And what I want to do right now is break some news to you, especially if you come from a strictly yoga background, which I did at one time too. Yoga is not the silver bullet here. Yoga in and of itself is not going to give us what we need to create this direct line of communication to all the parts of ourself. It's not actually going to produce that psycho-spiritual state of yoga because as I explained earlier, yoga primarily deals with the conscious mind and a little bit the superconscious, but it doesn't really address the unconscious. So we have to bring in other tools. We have to bring in more tools than just yoga. We'll use the yoga, but we also need other skills to be a fully developed spiritual leader. For the modern Western client and student that we work with. And some of those other skills include techniques like astrology. Astrology has always been a tool of spiritual leadership, and it helps us to tap into the superconscious and find out some of the energies, habits, patterns, and tendencies we as individuals are dealing with. It also helps us to lift up the psyche and look under the hood and see the blueprint of the psyche of the person that we're working with so we can kind of understand who they are. Fun fact, Carl Jung, founder of depth psychology, when he saw clients, would not see them until he had read their natal chart because he said it saved him 6 months of just talking to this client and figuring out who they were. When he read their natal chart, he knew what he was dealing with, and he could get right in to solving whatever problem they were there to get help with. Pretty powerful stuff. So we need to bring astrology into our work for spiritual leadership to get those bigger answers, to get those bigger patterns and habits and tendencies, to see where life's purpose is for this individual. A method of divination is also helpful. And I'm not talking about it in a way that it's magic or, magic. I'm talking about divination in a way that it helps us tap in to a bigger part of ourself. You'll find that any forms of divination or mediumship never tell you anything that you don't already know. But it helps you to get clear and to reveal to yourself what you do know and affirm it within you. So the best Western method of divination is the tarot deck. And I'll be doing a podcast in the next few episodes on the tarot to give you a little bit of 101 on that. The tarot deck is infinitely helpful because it is written with the psychology, mythology, and symbolism of the Western psyche. So it has imbued in the cards the myths, symbols, and the images that we need for our psyches to speak to us and show us exactly what we need to know. It basically helps us lay our cards out on the table. It gives us those quick answers to those big questions. We also need to bring in alchemy. Alchemy is the Western format of psychological and spiritual change and transformation. And alchemy has within it very similar principles to yoga's chakras and nadi system. So that'll be a future podcast too. I'm just giving you things to look forward to. But what I want to do is encourage you and to reassure you that even with these three parts of the psyche, that you have some tools to work with in order to create these systems of communication. Meditation is very important. Anything to bring the mind, body, and spirit together is very important. But have no doubt that this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to integrate all of the parts of ourselves and to hear and listen to all of the wisdom and inspiration that we all always have access to, because we are whole and complete human beings. Yoga tells us nothing if it doesn't tell us that. We are whole, complete, and perfect exactly as we are. So to develop the skill set to listen to the messages, to receive the messages, to understand what they're pointing us to, and to reveal the gold that is constantly being shown to us is the work of the spiritual practitioner. And as the spiritual leader, you get the privilege of helping guide people to their own gold and manifest their greatest and truest potential. So I hope that makes you excited to learn more and start the work. I hope that you've enjoyed this talk about the three parts of the psyche and that it gives you something to consider and work with. And remember that this is not just the way you are. You can be however you want to be. And what I wish for you is that you manifest your truest potential, your deepest meaning, and your greatest connection to everything around you. So I'll look forward to speaking to you again on the next podcast. And until then, please take care of yourselves and take care of each other.